Today's video is the homemade knockdown texture versus store-bought texture in a can, the knockdown contest. What I've got is some 20-minute mud. This is quick mud that you mix up. You work out all the powder. It's 2 parts powder, 1 part water. So half as much water as the powder that you use. And you can adjust it for thickness a little bit depending on what you like. You know, if I'm doing something overhead, I usually make it a little thicker. Don't want the stuff dropping on me. And if it's on the wall, you know, a little bit thinner. But basically 2 parts powder, 1 part water, and you just mix it up really good. And it takes about 20 minutes to dry. So what I've got here is some a wall patch that was done before and fixed up, but wasn't completely happy with it. When you stood back, you could really see it. And so what I'm doing here is adding some mud to float it, and then using a much larger knife, the 12-inch knife or 16-inch knife, to go over it to float it in so that it spreads out the flat part. Now with texture, it's only going to show as good as your initial prep work. So sometimes you may need to cut out some material to make it flush. If any of the under the wall is showing through, any of the paper is showing through, you want to prime or paint that area first so that it doesn't bubble out. Because if it gets wet from the mud, a lot of times it can swell, and so that's why you're priming or painting it first, then doing your patch, and then doing your texture. Again, your texture can only come out as good as your patch, so what you're wanting to do is get it as flat as possible. So I'm using a metal drywall knife here, but what even works even better than that is a larger acrylic or plastic knife. Those actually even work much better, in my opinion. And again, so what I'm doing is making a much larger flat area, and as flat as it is what will, you know, ideally not show through at all. That way the patch doesn't show through. So it's just spreading, you know, this particular patch over a much larger area using a progressively larger knife on each coat to get, you know, a better spread so that it hides the patch. Because this one was kind of visible from when you step back. And so the idea is to get it to completely disappear, and then once that's nice and smooth, do your texture over that. And also when you knock down the texture, if you don't have any lines or if it's not completely flat, when you try to knock it down, sometimes that'll bump your knife. So that's why you want your patch to be really nice and flat. Sometimes you may have to cut out material in order to get a completely flat and smooth patch. But that's the goal with the patching. I don't like sanding, so my kung fu maintenance method is to use a wet rag to sand. Basically, I use the rag or a wet sponge, and that way I don't have to sand. But because the material is generally the 2 parts powder, 1 part water, once it dries, using a wet rag works extremely well to smooth down any areas, and then you don't have to breathe in all that dust. I see so many people sanding it down, which is fine, but in my opinion I can get it just as flat, just as nice, without having to breathe all that dust in. So and if there's a concern there about mold or whatnot, well, you're sealing your wall first so that the cardboard is not exposed, and so you're making it, you know, water resistant, and then you're adding your patch. And really, when you're mixing up mud, you're mixing it with water anyway, so there's a little bit of moisture. And so by using a wet rag on the wall, once your mud dries, it's not really much different than adding a wet mud patch. You know, it's kind of the same thing. So that's why I like to use the wet rag to Knockdown again. It just you're bringing everything as smooth as you can with your knife, with your drywall knives, and then even scraping down any larger areas with the drywall knife. But then when you need to sand, I prefer using a wet rag. That's just the Kung Fu maintenance method. So here I'm mixing up the drywall mud specifically for the texture, and this is the homemade texture. And what I'm doing is mixing it extra thin. So I'm doing the 2 parts powder, 1 part water first, and then now I'm adding even a little bit more water to make it much thinner. And that way when I fling it on with a brush, and you can use any number of types of brushes to fling it on, but it's not rocket science. It's a very simple thing here. But you can get different patterns of drywall based on the brush that you fling it on with, and also how thin you mix the mud. So mine's just a little bit thin for a good medium to heavy knockdown texture, and so that's what I get in a little bit larger clumps flung on. So here it is. I'm wiping it down with my wet rag. I usually use a little bit of kind of warm water and the rag, and kind of trying to keep it on the area so that I'm just around the perimeter just a little bit, because if you wipe that rag anywhere else, it'll create a haze from the drywall dust that's in the rag. You can kind of see the haze around the outline of where I wiped it down. And the finished product on this one, I realized I probably could have wiped it down a little bit more, because anything that's not perfectly flat, that's what's going to show through. But I'm happy with this one. It came out well enough. It was much better than what it was in the end. You'll see. I'll show you the photos towards the end. But so here I've got my texture mixed up, and I'm ready to fling it on. Definitely you want to wear some old clothes. This will have a tendency to spring back at you too, and if you take your time with it a little bit more than I did, you're less likely to fling yourself, and probably really a good idea to wear safety glasses too. I wasn't here, so you don't want that stuff getting flung in your eye. Also good to take precautions to protect your flooring or your other finishes. This one I just had a piece of cardboard down, but even that I could have done a little bit more with a little bit more. Tendency to splash me though. A little bit more coverage to prevent it from going other places, as it just has a tendency to do that. It was actually even splattered the wall to the right a little bit as well. But yeah, that's how it is. Homemade texture. It's nice. This was kind of a big patch for it, but for little tiny patches, it's really nice to know that you can do this, because it'll save you time, especially, if you're in an occupied unit, you need to get out of there, or some other situation where you need it to dry faster. This is a 20-minute mud, so it will dry really fast, and it's ready for paint in 20 minutes. And, so you got to just mix up what you're going to use within 20 minutes, and you got to knock this down pretty quick, a minute or two after you apply it. But very easy to work with. The brush that I'm using is a nylon air conditioner fin brush. Works extremely well for this, as it's got long bristles on it, and I'm pretty sure it's nylon, but they're plastic and very easy to wash off and clean off, and just worked really easy. I may experiment with a few different techniques. This one I was just flicking it on, and that worked really well, but like I was saying, it kind of flicked back at me a little bit. I'll also try to put links in the description below of the different things used, the different tools and the different products. But it worked good, and again will work, I think, really good in the future for little small areas, especially where you've already got your mud pan dirty and everything. And cheaper than the cans of texture are, $15 to $25, depending on where you get them and what you get exactly. It's just nice knowing that I don't necessarily need that for every job. So here I'm keeping my hands clean. It's a lot easier to keep other things clean when you keep your hands clean and keep things clean. Just makes keeps from spreading the mud around. Yeah. So here it is, knocking down the texture. I find just keeping the knife perpendicular. I like to use a smaller knife for knocking it down. It helps prevent walking of the knife. Walking is what happens if it catches on something, and then it just creates a line, like a diagonal line from where the knife gets walked by accident. And so by using this smaller knife and just knocking it down pretty quick, I try not to think about it too much. I just get it done. I just keep the knife perpendicular to the wall and just get it done. It's, you know, again, it's not rocket science. It's just knocking it down so that it makes flat areas of the texture. Very easy. So this one was the homemade texture on the Knockdown. And I somehow missed recording spraying on the spray can of texture, but I have shown that so many times in other videos. You can look it up in other videos where I show that. But the smaller patch that's to the left, I did with the can of texture, and then this one with the homemade texture. And the nice thing is if you notice an area that needs a bit more, like I did here, you can add a little bit more in and
splatter me.
Get it done. The spray cans generally have a few different adjustments: an adjustment for pressure of the nozzle and a dial for adjusting the size of the knockdown texture. Again, I cover that in more detail in other videos of knockdown texture from a can. And here it is, knocking down the store-bought texture. The texture has been sprayed on with the can. Waited a couple minutes and then just knocking it down. Same thing, just keeping the knife perpendicular, not thinking about it too much, just getting it done. I find the smaller knife works better to keep from walking the knife by accident. Very easy. I actually found it, a lot easier applying the store-bought can of texture, in that it's a one-handed operation. I almost caught myself looking at putting some of the stuff on there, but then I was like, no, that's supposed to be the homemade side. So I did wanted to get an accurate test. Nice and easy to keep working with a clean knife, and then the bristle brush cleaned off really easy too. Same deal, just a little water, wash it off. Here's the texture drying on. Everything's knocked down. The store-bought texture shows up a bit more yellow, and the homemade texture more white, just like the drywall compound. So it's a little bit harder to tell what's exactly going on. Here I'm just wiping up around the edges where it's splattered a little bit outside where I need it to, and just checking things out. Yeah, it's ready for paint. Some of the store-bought textures you need to wait an hour, and some of them 24 hours before painting. So this, if you want it to come out even better, you'll use a primer. Primer has a little bit different function than paint. It acts as a sealer, and it helps block stains, and then it also helps dull any slight imperfections in the wall material. So it has a little bit different function, and then that can be followed up with painting. So this is painting up the homemade texture, but if you don't prime it, you're going to want to do at least 2 coats. Again, you'll get better coverage with primer. It'll make your finished job come out better, but time constraints being what they are, and we don't live in a perfect world, as I often say, so sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But if you want it to come out even better, prime it first. And you can get water-based primers. They're a little bit easier to work with. And but anyway, I'm pretty happy with this one. Came out good. Not perfect, but definitely. I don't think anyone will really notice it at all, when it's done. So. This one needed to paint a little bit more area to make sure it covers over all the drywall dust I was explaining that can have a tendency to show up a bit more, so it might not be a bad idea to just roll out the whole wall. Storebought texture. Tricky. No, you lift up on it and then it goes up and over, I believe. Yeah. Ah. Yeah.
Okay, alright.
That's the trick.
I
I know.
manhandle it.
Yeah. Oh, broken, I own it.
Yeah, nice butter refrigerator.
Alright. Homemade versus store-bought. See how it dries. Okay, I'm gonna do a second coat, but there's the deal. Trying in. Homemade, store-bought. Homemade, store-bought. First coat. Alright, time for a second coat of paint, but there's the homemade, store-bought. Alright. Looks like I'll need to definitely do the second coat, but here's the homemade patch. Definitely is affected by the shadows, and then here's the store-bought patch. So showing the difference. Neither of them perfect, but it, some of this is that it needs another coat of paint, and maybe need to roll this whole wall really. But thought I'd just show you that that's, texture-wise, I'm pretty happy with both. This one I can see a little bit more through it. So, I could probably float over this side a little bit more. But, again, neither one's perfect. And that's that. So, but homemade versus store-bought. I'll try to do another follow-up once I paint it up. And there it is after 2 coats of paint.